expedient and inexpedient. Let's read the verses, and then we'll make some comments. Paul says in verse 12, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not lawful for Paul. What he means there is that all things that are expedient are lawful. He doesn't say that fornication is lawful. He doesn't say that covetousness is lawful. He just said there a moment ago in verse 10 that a thief or a covetous one or a drunkard or a violator or an extortioner, he'll not inherit the kingdom of God. So to say that all things are lawful for me without any modification, as Leon Morris does, is sheer rubbish. All things are not lawful. Paul is discussing things in the realm of expediency. Well, what about expedient things? What is an expedient thing? Well, in order for a thing to be expedient, number one, it must be lawful. The word expedient means advisable under certain circumstances. If the thing is not lawful, it's not advisable under any circumstance. In order for it to be lawful, in order for it to be expedient, it must be lawful. If it is not lawful, it can never be expedient. This shows that Paul is dealing with matters of moral indifference. If it is not a matter of moral indifference, it is unlawful. But Paul says all things are lawful, therefore the all things must be matters of moral indifference. He said anything that is morally indifferent is lawful. Right? But he's not discussing mere lawfulness. He's discussing expediency also. In order for a thing to be expedient, it must, number two, be edifying. It must be edifying. If a thing is not edifying, it's not advisable. It's not helpful. If a thing is not edifying, it is definitely not expedient. If you would, you could put Romans 14 and verse 19. Romans 15, verse 2. 1 Corinthians 10, 23 and 24. In Romans 14, 19, Paul, in a little bit of different context, but not too much. In Romans 14, 19, the Apostle Paul is dealing with meats. Does a man have the right to eat any kind of meat, is the question. Paul answers, yes, of course he is. However, if he insists upon eating the meat and causing the brother to stumble, he's not edifying that brother. Therefore, it's not expedient to eat it. 14:19 of Romans says, so then, let us follow after things which make for peace, and things whereby we may edify one another. Overthrow not for meat's sake the work of God. All things indeed are clean, howbeit it is evil for that man who eateth with offense. So, he tells them, it's lawful to eat meat, but it may not edify your brother. And what you and I ought to do, and we'll talk about this more when we get to chapters 8 through 10, what you and I ought to do is follow after things which make for peace and things by which we may edify one another. Okay, so it's lawful for me to do certain things. But that's not the whole question the Christian must answer. It is also, is it edifying? Does it build up my brother to do it? Does it build up my brother to do it? In 1 Corinthians 10, 23 and 24, we'll just read it and then leave it. He says in 10:23-24, dealing with meats, all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. Let no man seek his own, but each his neighbor's good. What he says then is, all things are lawful. That is, all things that are morally indifferent are lawful. He says, but not all of them are edifying. Consequently, if it's not edifying, it's not advisable. The third point, in order for a thing to be expedient, it must be non-enslaving. It must be non-enslaving. Paul says, all morally indifferent things are lawful. However, I will not permit anything, whether it's lawful or not, to become my master. He said, meat's for the belly and the belly for meats. All he says is true, that eating meat is a God-given arrangement. But I will not let that become my master. I'll even set that aside if I find it necessary. And he does. In chapter 10, he says, in the conclusion, anyway, of the discussion, the last verse of chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians, he said, wherefore, if meat causes my brother to stumble, I'll not eat meat while the world stands. Oh, he said, I believe God made the belly for meats and meats for the belly, but if it doesn't edify my brother, I want to set it aside. This is a liberty, you see, he's discussing. He's discussing some liberties. And he says that a liberty which you cannot set aside is not a liberty. If I have the liberty to go pool playing, which in many areas has a very bad connotation with it, if I cannot set that aside, if I'm compelled to go by my desire to go, my liberty really isn't a liberty at all. It's my master. Paul says, I won't let anything become my master, lawful or unlawful. 1 Corinthians 6:12 and following. Paul says, number one, he teaches, that is, in order for it to be expedient, one, it must be lawful, two, it must be edifying, and three, it must be non-enslaving. If it takes a grip of a man and he can't get free, then it's not expedient. It's not unlikely that the Greeks here have heard of the letters sent from Jerusalem. You remember in the book of Acts chapter 15, which forbade the eating of meats offered to idols and abstinence from blood and fornication. If this is true, and it's doubtless almost a certainty, a very strong probability at the weakest. If this is true, it is also likely they objected to this legislation in regard to meat and insisted on the right to eat meat since it was meat for the belly and the belly for meat. When the Jews sent, the Holy Spirit said, what we want the Gentiles to do is not to eat meat offered to idols. A Greek would quickly say, now wait a minute, an idol's nothing. I've got the right to eat that meat if I wish. It was given for my belly, and my belly was made for that meat, and I've got the right to eat it. So they'll object to the letter. Paul will here agree with his master, but he maintains this to be a temporary situation, that is the belly meat arrangement. And he maintains that that's a temporary arrangement for a coming day would see a change in our constitution, and the meat belly arrangement would be gone. Paul will not become a slave to this meat belly arrangement. He's going to be its master. If the circumstances justify it, he'll not eat meat while the world is standing. 8:13. He'll not be enslaved to even a God-given arrangement, such as the bodily appetite for meat. In regard to fornication, however, there's no such God-given arrangement. The sex impulse might be as natural as eating, but God has set bounds to it. The belly may be for meats, but the body's not for fornication. It's made for the Lord. Somebody says, well, sex is just natural. These Corinthians would. sex is just natural. It's just as natural as the belly meat arrangement. Paul says both of them are very natural. But the body's not made for fornication. I don't care what you say. The belly's made for meats. That's right. But the body's not made for fornication. Well, now, the Greek was never too happy about material substance. It was a prevailing idea that the body was a prison house and a burden. You know how the Gnostics held to that view. And if one became a Gnostic, this either produced a severe asceticism or a wallowing in sensuality. The body here in this particular passage, the body is not for fornication but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. The body here embraces the human frame as a whole, being regarded as distinct from any and all temporary organs or arrangements. The proof of that is that we're still going to have a body when there's no belly and meat arrangement. He's not talking about one particular aspect of the body. He's just speaking of the body as God created it, as a whole human frame, as God intends it to be when we enter the other side. He tells them that the body will be resurrected. That's verse 14, look. And God, who's raised up the Lord, will raise up us through His power. In verse 15, he tells them the body is a member of Christ. Know ye not that your bodies are members of Christ? He tells them that the body is the temple of the Spirit. That's verse 19. Know ye not that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit which is in you, which you have from God? This is for the Lord, and the Lord for it. The very design of the body, the very purpose for its very existence is, as he says right there, for the Lord. Verse 13. The body is not for fornication, but for the Lord. The only reason that you and I have a right to have a body is because God has given it to us to be an instrument of Jesus Christ. That's all. Angels don't have bodies like you and me. We do. And the body that God has given us has one reason for existence, and that is to be for the Lord. The expression for the Lord and its proper use, the proper use of the body, can only be attained because of Christ's personal interest in our body. That expression, for the Lord, according to Robertson, is the dative of personal interest. That is, the Lord is personally interested in the body. He made it for Him. He wants it to be exercised in that way, and that's the only reason it has for existence. These things being true, whatever action is antipodal, that is the extreme opposite. Whatever action is antipodal to the very purpose for which the body exists is a sin peculiarly against the body. Drunkenness, for example, is the abuse of the body by the perversion of a lawful function of the body. You know, drinking. But drunkenness is a perversion of a lawful function of drinking. So also is gluttony. Now, the lawful sex act is, however, the most intimate act possible between the most closely united people under heaven. This action, physical relationship between husband and wife, this action has the specific purpose. The act itself has the very purpose of expressing that unity between husband and wife. The husband and wife, according to Scripture, are really one flesh. They're so closely united in the mind of God and have entered into such a close covenant that they are the most closely united people on earth. And that physical activity between a husband and wife has the very purpose of expressing that unity. Because the husband's body belongs to the woman. 1 Corinthians 7:4. And the husband's body belongs to the woman, and the woman's body belongs to the husband. 1 Corinthians 7:4 and Ephesians 5:28 through 31. And Ephesians 5:28 through 31, we discover that a husband and wife, really, in the eyes of God, are one flesh. That's verse 28 and following. Even so ought husbands also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his own wife loveth himself. For no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as Christ also the church. Because we are members of his body, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now that which was declared back in Genesis tells the truth, not only of a husband and wife, but of Jesus and the church. Consequently, a member of the body of the Lord, really in a very, I don't want to say mystical sense, but in a very real sense, belongs to Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 there, he tells us that a Christian and his body, verse 15, your bodies are members of Christ. It's as if you pictured Jesus Christ as a man, and every part of his body is made up of a Christian. To take a Christian and to have him participate in any unlawful activity is to take members of Jesus. It is as if you took the hand of Jesus to do crime. Of course you don't. But it is as if you did. Thus it is as if Christ himself were committing crime. It's not true. But because we are so closely united to Jesus, as a husband is united to a wife, then anything that you and I do which is wrong is, as it were, bringing Christ into our criminal activity. When a husband commits fornication with another woman, he takes the body that not only belongs to him, but belongs to his wife, and he commits fornication. So it is, as it were, that her body is prostituted in guilt. The union being so close, the two being one flesh, when a man gives himself to unlawful sex action, he is bringing his wife, as it were, into the whole situation. But there's more to it than that. For you see, this activity between the husband and wife expresses the unity between the husband and the wife. And any man who engages in fornication, he is in that act prostituting the act which is ordained by God to express a profound unity. And thus he enters into a unity with the harlot. Since the Christian's body, this is verse 15, since the Christian's body is the body of Jesus, it's a member of Jesus, such an action would unite Jesus to the harlot. Well, that can't be. Such conduct must lead to the severance of the union between Christ and the man. But since the body was created by God to be united to God, since this is its very reason for its existence, fornication is a sin peculiarly against the body. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that fornication can't be forgiven. Of course it can. But the point being expressed by Paul here is this, that as the sex act between a husband and wife was ordained by God to express the unity between the two of them, the exploitation of that act is prostituting an action which in itself, when it's occurring between lawful partners, testifies of unity. Add all that. That's a little bit obscure, I'm sure. But add all that to this. When these fellows in Corinth committed fornication, it's almost certain that they committed fornication with a temple prostitute. Up on the Acrocorinthus, they had this temple to Aphrodite. Every evening, I think it's 200 or 500, prostitutes would come down into the town and they would ply their trade there. And when the man lay with a woman and gave her money, it was considered as religious activity. It was a part of worship. For this cause, 2 Corinthians chapter 6:14 and following speaks about the unity, the disunity between Christ and the devil, between the temple of God and the temple of the devil. So here, why is fornication then peculiarly a sin against the body? Because fornication is the abuse of a lawful sex act. That sex act is intended, it's ordained by God to express unity with the individual with whom it is performed. And consequently, Paul says in 15, know ye not that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? In lying with a woman, a man becomes peculiarly one with her. And he says what you're really doing is taking the members of Christ, your body, which belongs to Jesus, which is a part of Christ, in that spiritual and religious relationship, and you are joining him, as it were, to a harlot. Oh, God forbid. 16, know ye not that he that is joined to a harlot is one body? Again, this is what the sex act indicates between husband and wife. And if this man thinks he's lawfully doing this, if this man thinks it's all right to lie with this temple prostitute, if he's willing to do it, he is joining with her to become one person, and is dragging, as it were, Christ along with him. Since he has a body that is made for the Lord and for the Lord alone, then to use the body in that way is to sin peculiarly against the body. And that's what he says in verse 18. Or know ye not that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit which is in you, which you have from God? He said, are you not aware that the Spirit of God is dwelling in your body? That you are a temple of God. And so when they go with these prostitutes, what they were doing was making the temple of God unite with the temple of the devil, one in whom Satan dwelt. And so you had this unity, this one spirit notion. Verse 20, what he tells them in the latter part of 19, you don't belong to yourself. You're not your own. You don't have a right to do with yourself what you want to. You belong to Jesus since you committed your heart and your mind to him. And he says, act accordingly. For you were bought with a price. Christ bought you by his blood. Glorify God, therefore, in your body. The King James said, and your spirit, which is the Lord's. It's not in the Revised Version. All right. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 6 regarding law and impurity. Do you have any question or comment?
Just one question. Sorry, remember the word fornication and immorality. Now, would this include all sexual acts or just fornication?
It's not easy to tell. The word fornication has about three meanings. The first and radical meaning of the word fornication is sexual activity between unmarried people. That's the first meaning of it. The second meaning is adultery. It's used in this sense in the book of Matthew 5:32. And then the third sense is this one right here. Any kind of immoral practice. I don't know that immoral practice is the best rendering here. For it seems to me he's speaking about a very specific activity. I mean, he who is immoral in his mind, Jesus said, has committed adultery with a woman already in his heart if he looks on her with the intention of lusting after her. And consequently, it seems to me that he's talking about the overt action here. Fornication in its first and second senses. Well, it could be the first, it has to be the second. All right. Chapter 7. 1 through 40. In this section, we have a number of related questions put to the apostle in connection to marriage. We have general remarks concerning marriage, general remarks concerning marriage. That's 1 through 7. We have words addressed to the unmarried and the widow. That's verses 8 and 9. Then we have words addressed to the married, 10 and 11. Then we have words addressed to those in mixed marriages. (12 through 16). Then we have words concerning the constant principle of the Christian life. The constant principle of the Christian life. Verses 17 through 24. Then we have words concerning virgins. Verses 25 through 38. Concerning virgins. 25 through 38. Then we have words concerning widows. 39 and 40. Regarding the general remarks on marriage, we'd need to say that there are those who believe that the unmarried state is morally superior. That's completely incorrect. In the book of Genesis chapter 2 verse 18, it was God who instituted marriage, because the general truth is this, that it's not good that a man should be alone. And that which God created cannot be regarded as a moral inferior to some other situation. It's true, of course, that in cases, with certain individuals, to be unmarried is the better thing, but only for him, and not as a blanket arrangement. Paul will speak in a moment or two and urge people, it would be better if you were unmarried because of the troubles that are on us. But he doesn't make this a rule. The apostle will not downgrade marriage, since it is an institution of God. Celibacy cannot be regarded as a moral superior, even though it has certain advantages. But of course, there are some aspects of being unmarried that are disadvantages. I mean, a gentleman who is unmarried can never be an elder. He can never really appreciate the problems of children. I mean, really, experientially, that is. The rule is, man should marry, for it is not good that man should be alone. But there are people, and Paul was one of them, who, because of a gift of God, verse 7, Paul claims in verse 7 that his ability to stay celibate is a gift of God. Some people don't have to be married. Paul urges that the marriage state, for practical reasons, ought to be held to. And the practical reasons are to avoid fornication. Now, that's not the only reason for marrying, of course. That's the only point that Paul wants to bring out there at the moment. And we'll get to this text in a minute. In addition to this, the Corinthians were enduring some present distress, or more likely were about to undergo it, and thus adding responsibilities at such a time would be tough on them. It'd be impractical for them. Now, at no time does Paul order men to marry. Fornication must be avoided, and marriage would help accomplish this. But marriage was a personal decision, as was celibacy. To avoid the prevalent immorality, each man was to have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. In the marriage relationship, the wife is required by God to satisfy the man's biological needs, and so also the man the woman, in verses 3 and 4. When he says in verse 5, defraud ye not one another. That plainly means don't refuse each other the conjugal rights, unless it be by mutual agreement. And that agreement has for its aim a period of devotion to God. And it seems to me right here that such advice ought to be considered by preachers who leave their wives for months on end to preach meetings. Should this not be by mutual agreement? These pacts are to be made realistically, so as not to be a source of great temptation. Some will handle such situations with more ease than others. Let's then go to the text, 1 through 7. Now, concerning the things whereof you wrote, they had written and asking questions. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. And here the expression not to touch a woman means to marry her. But because of fornication, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife her due, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife has not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband has not power over his own body, but the wife. That is, they both have committed each other to each other. And thus they've entered into this pact, and they belong to each other and must treat each other in accordance with the terms of that marriage agreement in the sight of God. He says in verse 5, defraud ye not one the other, except it be by consent for a season. You know, if you feel you want to do this, okay. Don't withhold the conjugal rights unless you both agree on the matter. And he says, let it be that you may give yourselves unto prayer. But he urges them in the latter part of verse 5 that they are to be together again, that Satan tempt you not because of your incontinency. Incontinency is the ability to control oneself. And he says, don't press your luck. Don't press your luck. Verse 6. He says, but this I say by way of concession, not of commandment. He says, now I'm not ordering you to do this. I'm not ordering you to do this. That is to marry and avoid fornication. The order is to avoid fornication. However you do it, do it. But the marrying arrangement is entirely up to yourself. I'm not saying you must be married, says Paul. Yet, verse 7, I would that all men were even as I myself. Howbeit, each man has his own gift from God, one after this manner, and another after that. He said, in order to avoid fornication, be married. Now, I wish that I would that all men were even as I, without the difficulties, without the need to fight hard to avoid fornication. But he says, howbeit, each man has his own gift from God, one after this manner and another after that. And this needs to be remembered when people are being urged to go into foreign countries and to go distant places and do mission work. Paul was a great man, of that there's no doubt. But Paul didn't have a family. And consequently, it must be remembered that every man who has a wife and children makes a decision not only for himself, but he makes it for his children. And while he has the right, of course, to make it for his children, the man is going to have to be pressured. The man will be pressured because he feels, here I've got, say, 2 or 3 children, maybe 4 or 5. And I hear the gospel preachers and the brethren urging me to go into somewhere like India or China or somewhere else. If I make the decision to go, that's all right. My wife is old enough to make the decision with me. But how about my children? I must learn and realize all the time, whatever decision I make for my children also. Now, Paul didn't have that problem. He just got up and went, and that was all right. I'm not saying that this makes any less of the man's activity. He was a glorious servant of the Lord. But it does mean that he felt he had an advantage over a fella or a family, a married couple. And he claims in verse 7 that his ability to remain unmarried without any problems is a gift of God. Verses 8 and 9, he speaks to the unmarried and the widows. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, It is good for them if they abide even as I. He said, I wish that you who are unmarried would stay unmarried. And if you're a widow, just stay unmarried. Abide even as I. But, verse 9, if they have not constancy, that is, if they can't control themselves, let them marry. If their heart yearns for this companionship all the time, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn, to be constantly torn up by this need for companionship. He said, marry. But if you can stay unmarried, I wish you would. But again, he's not ordering them to remain unmarried. He's simply asking them or suggesting to them, I wish that you would do what you were able to do what I am able to do. I wish if you are able to do it, that you would do it. So Paul nowhere here orders one to marry, nor does he order one to remain unmarried. We'll see this especially clearly when we get down into the chapter. He says if a man wants to marry, go ahead. He's not doing any wrong. And if he doesn't want to marry, that's even better. But still, to be unmarried is not morally superior. Sometimes it's practically better, but certainly not morally superior. If a man marries, it's not sin. If he remains unmarried, it is still not sin. Verse 10, now he speaks to the married. But unto the married I give charge, yea, not I, but the Lord. Now when he says, not I, but the Lord, he's indicating that the Lord has already spoken on the matter, and that he's not bringing in something new. Jesus has already spoken on this matter, about which he's going to speak. Jesus has spoken on it in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:5 and following. What does he say to them? He says this, unto the married I give charge, yet not I, but the Lord. The Lord has already written on it, that the wife depart not from her husband, that they remain married until the day that they die. The exception, of course, is 5:32 of Matthew, 19:4 and following, or 5 and following, fornication. He says, I don't want the wife to depart from her husband, but should she depart, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband leave not his wife. All kinds of problems enter into marriages. Jesus said marriage may only be dissolved upon two counts. Well, he really didn't mention one of them. But death is one, Romans 7:1 and following. And fornication is the other. Now, fornication doesn't destroy the marriage. Fornication just gives the basis. If the marriage wishes to, if the partner wishes to dissolve the marriage, he or she may, though Jesus doesn't encourage it. It has often been thought that Jesus is trying to give them a way out in Matthew 5:32. He's not. He's trying to keep them in, for they were leaving for every cause conceivable. And Jesus doesn't urge that once fornication is committed, that the marriage be thrown overboard. In fact, it seems to me that unless the case be very aggravated, that if a partner commits fornication, the other ought to be willing to forgive. Now, I'm saying that glibly. No, I'm not saying it glibly either. I'm saying it not knowing the experience. But I believe this with all my heart. I believe if my wife committed fornication, that I wouldn't feel the right to be free from her. Wouldn't feel the right. Fornication doesn't dissolve the marriage. Fornication just gives the reason. If the marriage be dissolved, it gives the basis for it. But bunches of problems enter into marriage, and sometimes two people find they're incompatible. And I don't just mean a little bit incompatible. I mean a whole lot incompatible. I know many girls who have married husbands who turned out later on to be drunkards and beat them. And they beat them badly and beat them for a long time. If such a woman decided to leave a husband, she's got the right to do it. But she has not the right to divorce. The Scripture says, verse 11, but should she depart, that's on the assumption, of course, that, something really bad is happening. Should she depart, let her remain unmarried. She's not permitted to contract another marriage. Or else, let her be reconciled to her husband. He said, now do one or two things when you break up. Lady, if it's the lady, you stay unmarried because you don't have the right to contract another covenant of marriage. Or you could be reconciled to your husband. He says the same thing of the husband in verse 11. But to the rest, say I, not the Lord. When he says that, he doesn't mean that what he's about to say is not from the Lord. He's simply saying that what he now says has not been already spoken by the Lord. The Lord has not already said something concerning it. He said, what I'm now giving you is a new revelation. I'm giving you something which Jesus himself did not give you. And what is it? He deals with the question of a marriage between a believer and an unbeliever. Now, Jesus in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:4 and following was speaking in a Jewish setting. And there was no occasion for him to speak of a marriage between a believer and an unbeliever, for the Jew would not marry someone other than a Jew. So he didn't have any occasion to deal with it. But Paul has occasion to deal with it. And he does. Verse 12. If any brother hath an unbelieving wife, and she is content to dwell with him, let him not leave her. Some people, now remember these are questions that they've written and asked him, 7:1 there. Some apparently have the problem, and we'll see it in a moment or two in verse 14. Some have the problem of saying, well, now if I enter Christ and become a new creature, how about these old relationships? How about this wife of mine who is still an unbeliever? Or the woman might say, how about this husband who is still an unbeliever? Am I in a bad relationship? Paul says no. If the unbeliever is willing to stay with the believer, they're to stay together. Now he says if the unbeliever is willing, he knows what the pressures are against the marriage. Because bear this in mind now, and if you don't bear this in mind, the main thrust of this section will be missed. Corinth was the most godless city in the world at that time. The people were immoral to the core, and a part of our introductory material was just on that very issue. It was noted for its gross immorality and worldliness. Barclay says this, Corinth was a byword for evil and immoral living. The very word Corinthiasthai, to live like a Corinthian, has become a part of the Greek language. And it meant to live with drunken and immoral debauchery. Aelian, the late Greek writer, tells us that if ever a Corinthian was shown upon the stage in a Greek play, he was shown drunk. He goes on to say, above the isthmus there towered the hill of the Acropolis, and on it there stood the great temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. To that temple were attached 1,000 priestesses. I said 200 to 500. You see that was incorrect. It's 1,000. Who were sacred prostitutes. And at evening time, they descended from that hill and they worked their trade on the streets of Corinth until it became a Greek proverb. It is not every man who can afford a journey to Corinth. In addition to these cruder sins, there flourished in Corinth far more secret vices, which had come in with the traders and the sailors from the ends of the earth, until Corinth became not only a synonym for wealth and luxury, drunkenness and debauchery, but also for filth. Now, this is the background in which these people are living. That is what they're raised in. That is what they're taught in the schools. That's what they're taught as a part of religion. And so when a believer becomes when one becomes a believer, we have now in the family one who refuses to permit themselves to be involved in all this godlessness. And so very often, the believer would want to leave. But, says Paul, if the unbeliever, I said the believer, I meant very often the unbeliever would want to leave. But, says Paul in verse 12, if any brother have an unbelieving wife, and she is content to dwell with him, he is not permitted to leave her. And the woman that hath an unbelieving husband, and he is content to dwell with her, let her not leave her husband. He says in verse 14, there's nothing wrong with your union. There's nothing wrong with your relationship. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified in the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified in the brother. What he indicates is that the woman who becomes a Christian says to God, God, everything I've got belongs to you. You can have it. And I want to dedicate my husband to you. And she works with him, prays for him, teaches him, is obedient to him, loves him with all the intention of bringing him to God. As far as she is concerned, this man is dedicated to God by her. And vice versa. The husband will say to God, God, this unbelieving wife of mine, as far as I am concerned, belongs to you. I'll give her to you. And you and I will work with her and see if she can become a Christian. Now, that the marriage union between the believer and the unbeliever is okay is clear from the fact, he concludes the verse. If this is not true, if the relationship is not all right, else were your children unclean. He said, if you've got a bad union, if your union is an unholy union, what does that make your children? Well, unholy. He said, but your children aren't unholy. They're holy. That is, they're pure. They're clean. Little children, that is. If they're grown and adults, of course, they're ungodly wretches. Well, they're ungodly wretches. However, he said, listen, don't you worry about this relationship. Didn't matter what anybody tells you. Somebody had been apparently saying, look, once you become a Christian, you can't stay united to this unbeliever because a Christian ought not to be linked up with an unbeliever. But Paul says, no, that's not true. The unbelieving wife is sanctified in the believing husband, and the unbelieving husband is sanctified in the believing wife. It's a good union. And she or he dedicates the partner to God. On top of all that, he says, if it were a bad union, your children would be unholy, but they're not. They're good children of a good union. Yet, he says in verse 15, if the unbelieving departeth, let him depart. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases. Now, this has been used to teach that desertion is another grounds for divorce. And that's a very definite possibility. Just the way that text sits right there. However, if you again bear in mind what Corinth was like, the departure, the everyday life of the unbeliever. The everyday life of the unbeliever was one of immorality. Fornication was practiced by him all the time. And Paul says, if he wants to leave, let him leave. And if this passage, when it says the sister or the brother is not under bondage, if that means that they have the right to divorce, it's because Corinth was what Corinth was. They were practicing immorality. And if the unbeliever says, well, I'm going out, I'm just going to do what I want. Well, the believer is not to insist on, oh, you've got to stay with me. You're my husband or you're my wife, and you've got to stay with me, and make a whole fiddling row with the whole thing when the unbeliever is bent on departing. If you notice 15, it says, yet if the unbelieving departeth. That's in constant state of departing. So the unbeliever is doubtless saying time after time, here, I've had enough of this. Since you become a Christian, you're useless, or one way or another. And so Paul says, if the unbeliever wants to depart, that's up to them. Don't you feel bound to keep him. Now, if when it says, I'll repeat it, if when it says, upon the departure of the unbeliever, the brother or sister is not under bondage, if that means they have a right to divorce, it's only upon the very clear basis that the unbeliever is practicing iniquity every day anyway. However, the expression, not under bondage, is not the same as being able to put away. It just means that you're not bound to keep the husband with you, or you're not bound to insist that the wife stay with you. All right. But God hath called us in peace, or to peace. He said if the unbeliever wants to depart, there's no point of you trying to hold on. If the unbeliever is what the unbeliever in Corinth was, an ungodly wretch, look at the description of them in 1 Corinthians 6, 9, 10, and 11. It was horrible. If the unbeliever was doing all that and wanted to depart, you're wasting your time. Don't feel guilty about the departure. Don't feel you have to keep the marriage together because it's a ruined situation. Verse 16, for how knowest thou, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how knowest thou, husband, whether you shall save your wife? The verse can be understood in two opposite ways, and both of them are very arguable. Paul may be arguing, let him go if he wants to go. The partner says, but I'm trying to save him. And Paul says, well, how do you know that you can get the job done? On the other hand, the partner might say, well, I've got to get rid of him. I just don't want to stay with him. Paul says, well, why don't you stay? Because you never can tell. Maybe you could save your husband or your wife. Now, both those views are completely opposite, but both of them are very possible in the light of verse 16. He's either assuring the woman who wants to keep the husband, who insists on departing, he assures her, you don't know whether you can save him or not. Or he might be telling the partner who wants to leave the unbeliever, well, you don't know. Don't give up the boat too soon. You might save him. You might save her. 17 and following. Now here's a principle, 17 through 24. Here's a principle that Paul is teaching. He's teaching that whatever we do, whatever situation we're in, we can serve the Lord. He's saying this: there is no situation in life in which a man cannot serve God and serve Him well. Is God aware of the station in life of those who become Christians? Of course. The question is, can one serve God while married? Well, yes. Can one serve God while unmarried? Well, yes. Can one serve God while married to an unbeliever? Yes. Can one serve God while circumcised? Of course. Uncircumcised? Well, yes. Can a man who is a slave serve Jesus? Of course. Can a man who is a free man serve God? Of course. The impression is current among the Corinthians that all ties must be severed upon coming to Jesus. This is not so. Listen to him as we read 17 through 24. Only as the Lord has distributed to each man, as God hath called each, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all the churches. Was any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. That is, let him not feel he has to. Has anybody been called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. That is, don't let him feel he has to. Now we'll see this more clearly as we get further on down the chapter. 19, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. What matters? The keeping of the commandments of God. He said, I don't care what station in life you are when God calls you. Just bear this in mind, that you don't need to change it. Now, again, we're talking about matters of moral indifference. He's not saying that if you're a fornicator, you don't have to change it. You have to change it, all right. That's not a matter of moral indifference. He says to them, listen, I don't care what station in life you are, whether you're a Jew or a Greek, whether you're married or unmarried, whether you're a slave or a free man. Don't feel that you've got to change your station in order to serve the Lord. You can serve the Lord as you are. 20, let each man abide in that calling wherein he was called. He's not saying you can't change your job. He's not saying that if you can have your opportunity to become free, that you refuse it. That's not what he's saying. What he is saying is, you can serve God in any circumstance, and don't you let anybody con you into believing that you have to be in a certain station in life in order to do it. 21, were you called being a bondservant? Don't worry about it. Care not for it. That is, don't worry about it. Nay, even if you can become free, use it rather. He said, now, if you could with great, attempts become free, don't think that's such a great thing to do. Serve God as a slave, if it accords with the will. The point is, and I'll say it again and again, Paul is telling them, you can serve Jesus in any station in life. Were you called being a bondservant? 21, care not for it. Don't worry about that. Nay, even if you can become free, use it rather. Now, either he means stay a slave and serve him, or he said if you become free, serve him as a free man. 22, for he that was called in the Lord being a bondservant is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he that was called being free is Christ's bondservant. That's his point right there. He said, there's no difference whether you're a slave or not. You still serve the Lord well. That's all there is to it. Social status, marital status, makes no difference. You can serve the Lord in whatever condition you are in, socially and otherwise. Now, again, I say to you, he's not talking about an immoral relationships. That's not what he's talking about. Verse 23, you were bought with a price. Become not bondservants of men. The allusion here is to the fact that these men were teaching, you've got to break all these relationships. And they told them, listen, if you're a slave, you get out of it, because I'm telling you that Jesus is against slavery. If the man became a Christian and he was a free man, or even a master, they were saying, well, you can't be that. You can't be a Christian that way. Paul didn't believe that. Paul said, you stay in whatever station you are. Don't you let anybody bully into thinking you've got to leave your station in life. 24, brethren, let each man abide. Let each man, wherein he was called, therein abide with God. Again, I'll say to you, he was not saying that it's wrong for a slave to want freedom. He's saying to the slave, you can serve God just as surely in being a slave as you can in being a master. Now, all this language through 24 must not be pressed to mean that a man, if he wished to become circumcised, dare not, on pain of his being in rebellion to God. If a man wanted to become circumcised for health reasons or something else, Paul was not saying that was wrong. He circumcised Timothy. He refused to circumcise Titus. He did things when he saw the necessity. What he's saying here is, don't let anybody dupe you into believing you have to have a certain status in life to serve the Lord. The same type language as is here used will be used in 26 through 28, and it's clarified there. all external circumstances, if they be not immoral, are a matter of indifference relative to one's service to God. Therefore, saints were not to be snowed into turning everything upside down. The section doesn't teach a painter should stay a painter, or a baker stay a baker, or a salesman stay a salesman if they want to change. The point being stressed is there is no necessity for you to change your station. They were not to be ready to jump and run at everyone's counsel or demands. Verse 23, don't become a bondservant to anybody, but to hearken to God's instruction. Reiterated in verse 24. That's the general principle that governs the life of the Christian. You can serve Him anywhere and under any circumstances. Don't worry about changing them. If you want to change it, by all means, but don't think that you have to. Okay then. That takes us through to verse 24. Now concerning virgins, virgin women. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. In other words, he tells it clearly. What you ask about is a matter of opinion. One does what one wishes in the matter. God has no commandment one way or another. He says, but I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be trustworthy. Now the very fact that he says concerning virgins I have no commandment of the Lord, that implies that what he's been saying up to this point is from the Lord, you see. When he has no commandment from the Lord, he says so. But he leaves the rest of it without that prefatory remark, which clearly implies that what else he had to say was what the Lord taught him to say. But here the Lord taught him, Paul, I want you to give your opinion in the matter. See? Now the opinion was not binding. As he goes on to say, you don't have to take this advice, but God wants me to write my advice. You see? Here's what he says, and we'll cover this again. Now concerning virgins I have no commandment of the Lord, but I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be trustworthy. I think, therefore, that this is good by reason of the distress that is upon us, namely, that it is good for a man to be as he is, that is, without a wife, or, if he's married, to have a wife. Are you bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But, should you marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she has not sinned. Now what he said to them, this is my opinion. Just go along with it if you wish. However, if you don't take my opinion, it doesn't matter. Concerning virgins, Paul had no commandments from the Lord, but he's moved by God in conveying his judgment. This doesn't mean the section is uninspired, but that it is an opinion given under inspiration. The section in general does not have binding weight. And that's important now, mark you. It doesn't have binding weight. It's an opinion that one can take or leave. It is a judgment given to aid the people, but if it is not followed, no sin is involved. Verses 25, 28, and 36 and following. In 36 he says, if any man thinketh that he behaveth himself unseemly toward his virgin daughter, if she be past the flower of her age, and if he needs so requireth, let him do what he will, he sinneth not. He said, here's an area where God has no commandment, and he leaves it up to you. But he has asked me to give my opinion in the matter. And I'm suggesting to you that because of the present distress, it would be better for a man to not seek any additional responsibilities. It'd be better for a girl not to have the problems of a family on her shoulders. Now, he said, that's just my opinion, and God wanted me to give it to you. But if you don't go along with it, You haven't sinned in not going along with it. As mentioned above, such passages give added testimony to all other passages having no such prefatory remark. Now, the present distress of verse 26, A.T. Robertson thinks that Paul probably had the final coming of Jesus in mind. But that is absolute poppycock. It's impossible. Paul speaks of the coming of Jesus on a number of occasions and never speaks of it as a present or any other kind of distress. In any case, what would that have had to do with being married or not? Would he be saying, it would be better not to marry since the Lord is coming soon? What would be the connection? Why better? And if Paul had said the Lord was coming soon, he made a mistake anyway. And Paul didn't make mistakes like that. So A.T. Robertson didn't know what he's talking about. The distress was something of which Paul had knowledge and we don't. Some time of adversity which made the having of a family a burden, since it multiplied responsibilities and made the individual more vulnerable to hurt. Lightfoot has well said, a man who is a hero in himself becomes a coward when he thinks of his widowed wife and his orphaned children. That's the truth, isn't it? Verses 29 through 31, they indicate the great distress to be undergone by showing that at that time the norm of life, the usual rule, would be upset. Now, we've all experienced, to some little degree, how good food becomes tasteless. You had that experience? A fine home becomes a cheerless hall. Family comforts become matters of complete indifference. All this happens during periods of great tension or anguish. If you have a loved one seriously ill, what about friendly chit-chat? And you can't be bothered with it, can you? During the period of Nero's ungodly and fierce persecution of Christians, such feelings were doubtless entertained by Christians over a wide area. Now, it's true that that persecution was not very widespread, but its viciousness shocked the Church of God throughout the world and left them with deeply bitter memories. So vivid were the memories of the persecution by Nero on their brethren and sisters that they remembered him for 200 years as a horrible criminal against God's people. All right. Could this have been a distress? Well, it's very possible. But then we're guessing. Verses 32 through 34. Now, we have said, look, that those verses we just spoke about, verse 29. But this I say, brethren, the time is shortened, that henceforth both those that have wives may be as though they had none, and those that weep as though they wept not, and those that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and those that buy as though they possess not, and those that use the world as not using it to the full, for the fashion of this world passeth away. Now what he's simply saying is, that's turning upside down all their experience. It's turning upside down the norm of life. He said this trouble is going to make the pleasures of life, or even what we call everyday hardships of life, seem nothing. He said, listen, well, it'd be better if you weren't married, because I would rather, verse 32, I would have you free from cares. He that is unmarried is careful how he may please the Lord. But he that is unmarried, is careful for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married is careful for the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Now, he's not saying in 32 and 33 that the celibate is a better man, more dedicated. He's not saying that at all. He's simply saying that there are difficulties connected with being married, especially under pressure, that makes it more difficult for a man to be faithful and to be really deeply dedicated. It must be said, although it's not Paul's aim here, that there are many advantages connected with being married as opposed to celibacy. We'll take a look at the qualification of elders. One unmarried, though not bereft of sympathy or knowledge, is not in a position to understand the complexities of married life, and may therefore be less effective in many areas of God's work. Paul was a great evangelist. There's no doubt about it. He was a pioneer, extraordinary in nature. But an elder he never would have made. He never would have made an elder. He couldn't understand the internal problems, of the everyday working of a congregation. So while there are advantages in being married and disadvantages in being married, it's true on the other side also. All right. The making of marriages by parents. Well, let me read 34. He wants to please his wife and he's divided. So also the woman that is unmarried and the virgin is careful for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married is careful for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Now, this I say for your own profit. Not that I may cast a snare upon you, for that which is seemly, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. He said, now look, I'm telling you, I think it's better, in my opinion, especially now, under the circumstances of this present distress. I think it'd be better if you remained unmarried. But now, I'm not trying to put a snare on you. If you're not one of the kind who's able to stay unmarried, you be married. Don't think you're doing wrong. Now, in verses 36 and following, we have this to say. Well, he has this to say. Verse 36, but if any man thinketh that he behaveth himself unseemly toward his virgin daughter, I think daughter needs to be supplied there. If she be past the flower of her age, all these marriages were made very early on. And if need so requireth, let him do what he will. He sinneth not. Let them marry. But he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power as touching his own will, and hath determined in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he shall do well. So then, verse 38, both he that giveth his own virgin daughter in marriage doeth well, and he that giveth her not in marriage shall do better. One's not a sin. One is just more expedient than the other, is Paul's opinion. Now, the picture is of a virgin daughter. A man has a virgin daughter, and he's written, you see, and he's asked about these things. And Paul writes and says, well, under the present distress, if I were you, I would keep my virgin daughter unmarried. However, if the virgin daughter says, Daddy, I've met this man, I want to marry him, I'm in love with him, and I just want to be married. If he feels that he wants to set aside Paul's advice, well, by all means, let them marry, verse 36. But if the circumstances are right, and the father knows his daughter, really knows her, and knows that she doesn't need to marry this fella, and knows that it'll hurt her, and is dead certain in his heart and what he's doing is right, then he ought to go ahead and do it. Now, Paul didn't bring in this marriage as being arranged by parents. Paul found it that way. He didn't invent it. Marriages were made by parents. Paul did not invent it or bring it in. He deals with it as it presents itself. In spite of all he has said, if a father wishes to permit his virgin daughter to marry, that's okay. 36. However, if the parent, knowing his own child, and there being no necessity why she should marry, compare verse 9, she won't burn for companionship and so forth. If he knows there's no necessity why she should marry, and he decides to keep his daughter unmarried, he does no wrong. And under the present circumstances, the present distress, Paul in verse 38 thinks that he does even better than letting her marry. All right. Verses 39 and 40. Paul now returns to the widow. He says in 39, a wife is bound for so long time as a husband liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is free to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she abide as she is after my judgment. And I think that I also have the Spirit of God. He says, I think I also